What if story we were told was never complete? Not wrong, just incomplete, because sometimes history doesn't lie, it just leaves things out. And sometimes, those missing pieces are the most important ones, buried in ancient soil, lost in forgotten records, or hidden in the one place no one expected, our DNA. And recently, scientists found something they can't fully explain. Something small, easy to miss, but impossible to ignore. A genetic signal, faint, scattered, but consistent. And it points, not to where history says it should, somewhere else entirely, far to the north, to a place of ice, longships, and explorers who refused to stop at the edge of the world, Scandinavia. And the deeper they looked, stranger it became, because this DNA shouldn't be there, not like this, not this early, not this far. So the question is no longer if something happened. The question is, what did we miss? For most of modern history, the timeline has felt stable, clean, almost comforting. Humans arrived in the Americas more than 15,000 years ago. They crossed a land bridge from Asia, spread across continents, adapted, thrived, they built cultures, languages, entire civilizations. Then, much later, Europe entered the story. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west, and everything changed. That's the version we learn, the version repeated in classrooms. Books, documentaries, but like most simplified stories, set hides complexity. Because even within that timeline, there are cracks. Small ones, at first, then larger ones. For example, we now know Columbus wasn't the first European to reach North America. Centuries earlier, Norse explorers had already made the journey, sailing across the North Atlantic from Scandinavia to Iceland, to Greenland, and then beyond to a place they called Vinland. A land of resources, of opportunity, of unknown dangers, and for a long time, this discovery felt like the exception, a fascinating footnote, a brief encounter. A story that started and ended without changing much, but what if that assumption is wrong? To understand the mystery, you have to understand the people behind it, the Norse. Often remembered simply as Vikings, but they were more than raiders. They were explorers, navigators, risk-takers. They lived in a world that demanded resilience, harsh winters, limited farmland, constant pressure to expand, so they looked outward to the sea, and what they found changed everything. Their ships were unlike anything seen before, flexible, fast. Built for both open ocean and shallow rivers, they didn't just hug coastlines, they crossed oceans guided by stars, currents distinct, and a deep belief that there was always something beyond the horizon. By around the 9th and 10th centuries, they had already reached Iceland, then Greenland. And Greenland was no small achievement. It was remote, cold, unforgiving, but they settled there, built communities, raised families, and from Greenland, they saw something even more distant, something even more tempting, land further west. According to Norse sagas, explorers like Leif Erikson made the journey. They reached a new land, richer, more fertile, with forests, wild grapes, shores that Greenland lacked. They called it Vinland. For centuries, this story was debated. Was it real or just legend? Then, in the 1960s, something changed. Archaeologists uncovered a site in Newfoundland, Canada, evidence of Norse presence, structures, tools, artifacts, all pointing to one undeniable fact. They had been there. Not as myth, not as rumor, but in reality, and just like that, history shifted. Europeans had reached North America early 500 years before Columbus, but even then, stories stayed contained. Because the settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows was small, temporary, short-lived, there was no evidence of large-scale expansion, no cities, no lasting colonies. It seemed like a brief attempt, an exploration that didn't fully succeed, so historians placed it neatly into the timeline. Important, but limited. Significant, but not transformative. At least, that's what they thought. Here's where things get strange, because history depends on evidence. Artifacts, structures, written records, and when it comes to Norse activity in North America, that evidence is incredibly limited. One confirmed site, a few scattered hints, but nothing more, no widespread settlements, no deep integration, no clear legacy, which leads to a natural conclusion. They didn't stay, they didn't spread. They came and they left, end of story. But there's a problem with that conclusion, because absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, especially when the evidence you're looking for is fragile. Temporary, easy to erase, wood structures decay, small camps disappear, and if contact was brief or scattered, I might not leave obvious traces, but there's one thing that doesn't disappear so easily. One record that doesn't rely on stone or metal, one archive that carries history forward, even when everything else is gone. DNA, fast forward to the present. Technology has changed everything. We can now analyze DNA at a level that was impossible just decades ago. Scientists can trace ancestry, amami migrations, identify connections across thousands of years. And as genetic databases grew, so did the possibilities. Researchers began studying populations across the Americas, looking for patterns, origins, high links. At first, everything matched expectations. Indigenous populations showed strong connections to ancient Asian ancestry. European ancestry appeared where expected. Post-Columbian contact, colonization, migration, all consistent, all predictable. But then, small anomalies began to appear. At first, they were easy to ignore, tiny percentages, barely noticeable. But they kept showing up again and again and again, and they didn't fit. In certain genetic samples, scientists found markers linked to Northern Europe, more specifically, Scandinavia. Now, that alone isn't surprising. Modern populations in the Americas are diverse. European ancestry is common, but here's the problem. These markers didn't behave like recent ancestry. They didn't align with known migration timelines. They looked older, subtly different, out of place. As if they came from a different moment in history, and that's when things became difficult to explain, because if this DNA came from post-Columbian contact, it should look recent, clear, traceable. But it didn't. Instead, it looked like something else, something earlier, something unexpected. At this point, scientists did what they always do. They questioned everything. Was it contamination? Lab error? Misinterpretation? Could modern European DNA have mixed into samples somehow? Every possibility was tested, carefully, repeatedly, but the signal remained weak, consistent. And consistency is dangerous because it suggests something real, something reproducible, something that demands explanation. Still, idea was uncomfortable because it challenged the timeline. It raised questions no one was ready to answer, so the research stayed cautious, coquette, measured, but behind the scenes, mystery was growing. As more data came in, a pattern started to form. These Scandinavian-linked markers weren't concentrated in one place. They were scattered across different regions, different populations, not widespread, present, like fragments of a larger story. And that made things even more confusing, because if this DNA came from a single Norse settlement, you would expect a cluster, a central point, a clear origin, but that's not what they found. Instead, looked like multiple points of contact, small, disconnected, almost random, but not random enough to ignore. At this stage, the mystery became unavoidable. If Norse explorers only stayed briefly, how did their DNA spread? If they didn't integrate, why are there genetic traces? If their presence was limited, why does the pattern suggest something more? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, what if the story we tell about early contact is incomplete because the data doesn't lie, but it also doesn't explain itself, it just points? And right now, it's pointing towards something we don't fully understand. Then came a discovery that changed everything. A single genetic sample, buried within a larger data set. At first glance, nothing unusual, but on closer inspection, it stood out because this one sample didn't just hint at Scandinavian ancestry, it carried a clearer signal, stronger, more defined. And when scientists tried to place it in the timeline, they ran into a problem. It didn't fit. Not cleanly, not comfortably. It suggested a connection that shouldn't exist. At least, not according to what we know. Because if this sample is accurate, if the dating holds, if the interpretation is correct, then it leads to a possibility that changes everything. A possibility that scientists are still struggling to accept because it suggests that the Norse weren't the beginning of the story, just a part of it. And if that's true, then something else came before. Something earlier, something we haven't fully uncovered. And if that's the case, then the real question isn't just about Vikings, it's about everything we think we know. Because the deeper we look, more it feels like history is hiding something, and we're only just beginning to see it, a small anomaly turned into a growing mystery. Scientists analyzing genetic data across North America found something they didn't expect: traces of Scandinavian DNA, not recent, not clearly linked to colonization, but older, subtle, out of place. At first, it was dismissed, then questioned, then taken seriously. Because the signal didn't disappear, it repeated across different samples, different regions. And then, one genetic sequence changed everything. It didn't just hint at contact, it suggested a timeline that didn't fit, a connection that shouldn't exist. And a possibility that could quietly reshape history. To understand the anomaly, scientists had to answer one question: when did this DNA enter the population? That sounds simple, but it isn't. Because DNA doesn't come with a timestamp. It changes slowly, generation by generation. Tiny mutations accumulate over time, and by tracking those changes, scientists can estimate age, not precisely, but closely enough to build a timeline. So they began comparing modern Scandinavian DNA, ancient European samples, indigenous American genomes, layer by layer, looking for overlap, looking for divergence, looking for a point where the lines crossed, and at first, results seemed reassuring. Some of the Scandinavian-linked markers aligned with known Viking timelines. Around 800 to 1,000 years ago, that fits. That's expected. That's comfortable. But then something strange happened. A subset of these markers didn't quite match. They appeared slightly older, not dramatically older, but enough to shift the narrative, enough to create doubt, because even a difference of a few centuries can change everything. Then came the next question: where is this DNA located? If the source was a single Viking settlement, patterns should be simple: a cluster, a center point, radiating outward. But that's not what they found. Instead, markers appeared in scattered pockets. Disconnected regions, separated by distance, by geography, by culture. It didn't look like expansion. It didn't look like colonization. It looked fragmented, and that made things harder to explain. Because randomness can be dismissed, but patterns, even faint ones, demand attention. So scientists mapped it again, more carefully, more precisely, and slowly, a possibility began to take shape. Not one contact point, but many, not one event, but repeated ones. Small, temporary, almost invisible. This is where the story changes, because the simplest explanation was no longer enough. Instead of asking if Vikings reached North America, scientists began asking something else. How often did they come back? Because history tells us about one confirmed site, one settlement, one moment of contact, but DNA doesn't support a single moment. It suggests something more complex, something ongoing. What if Norse explorers didn't just arrive once, not returned, again and again? Seasonal voyages, exploration attempts, small crews testing the limits of the Atlantic, landing, leaving, coming back, not building cities, not creating empires, but making contact over time. That would explain the pattern, the scattered distribution, the faint genetic traces, because small groups leave small evidence, especially if they don't stay long, and especially if history doesn't record them. But then, most important question emerged because DNA doesn't spread through brief encounters, it doesn't move through trade alone. It doesn't linger from a passing visit. DNA spreads through people, through relationships, through generations, which means, at some point, there wasn't just contact, there was interaction, real interaction, human interaction. And that changes everything, because it suggests that Norse explorers didn't just land and leave, at least not all of them. Some may have stayed longer, long enough to connect, to share space, to become part of something local, not in large numbers, not in ways that would dominate the archaeological record, but enough to leave a trace, a quiet one, but a lasting one. So what does all of this mean? It means the story isn't as simple as we thought, not a single discovery, not a single arrival, but a series of encounters, small, scattered, unrecorded, but real. A world where oceans didn't completely separate people, where exploration didn't always lead to conquest, where contact could happen quietly and disappear just as quietly. And this idea is important, because it challenges the way we think about history. We often imagine the past in big moments, big events, big turning points, but sometimes history moves differently, in fragments, in subtle shifts, in connections that don't leave obvious marks. And that's what this discovery suggests, not a dramatic rewrite, but a quiet correction. A reminder that the past is more complex than the stories we tell about it. But here's the truth, not everyone agrees, because science doesn't move on possibility alone. It demands evidence, clear, repeatable, undeniable. And while the DNA signals are intriguing, they're not definitive. Not yet. There are still alternative explanations. Later European contact, unrecorded migration, statistical anomalies, contamination, even if unlikely, and these possibilities matter because extraordinary claims require strong proof. So the debate continues, carefully, cautiously, as it should. Because this isn't about proving a theory, it's about understanding reality, whatever that reality turns out to be. But even with uncertainty, one thing is becoming clear. Our understanding of early contact is incomplete, not necessarily wrong, but not complete, because the more we study DNA, more we realize something important. Human history is rarely clean, it's messy, overlapping, full of unexpected connections. People move, explore, interact in ways that don't always leave clear records. And sometimes, those movements are so small, so subtle, that they only survive in one place, the genetic record. So why does this matter? Why does it matter if a few Norse explorers reached North America earlier, or more often, than we thought? Because history shapes identity. It shapes how we understand ourselves, how we understand each other. And discoveries like this remind us of something deeper, that the world has always been more connected than we imagine, that even in the past, across oceans, across cultures, people found ways to meet, to interact, to leave traces of themselves behind, not always in monuments, not always in records, but in something more personal, more permanent, more human. And even now, mystery isn't solved. The data is still being analyzed, new samples are being studied, new techniques are being developed, and with each new discovery, picture becomes clearer or more complicated. Because that's the nature of truth. It doesn't always simplify things. Sometimes reveals just how much we don't know. So maybe the real question isn't, did Scandinavians leave hidden DNA in America? Maybe the real question is, how many other stories like this are still waiting to be discovered? Because somewhere, in ancient remains, in modern genomes, in data we haven't fully understood yet, there are answers, and those answers might not just change the past, they might change how we see the world.